The morning fog sits thick over the Atlantic coast. You hear the gulls first, then the bells for lauds. The women rise in darkness, their breath visible in the stone chapel. They wear undyed wool. Their hands are calloused from copying manuscripts. Some are barely past childhood. Others have served here 30 years. The monastery sits on a cliff. Below, the sea moves like hammered iron. One woman named Deirdre kneels at the altar. She's transcribing the Gospel of Mark. Her fingers are stained with oak gall ink. The vellum beneath her hand took 3 months to prepare. Every word matters. Every letter is a prayer. The bells stop. In that silence, you hear something else. A sound that doesn't belong. Wood scraping against stone. Footsteps that aren't sandaled. The smell of salt and smoke and something animal. The door explodes inward. Men pour through like floodwater. Their axes catch the candlelight. They're screaming in a language that sounds like breaking ice. One woman tries to run. She makes it 4 steps. They drag her back by her veil. The linen tears. Her hair spills out, red as autumn oak. This is Clonmacnoise. The year is 834. This scene will repeat itself 73 times across Ireland before the century ends. The abbot is killed first. They do it in front of everyone. His blood pools around the altar where Deirdre was working. The manuscript floats in it. The ink runs. Mark's gospel becomes illegible. Then, they turn to the women. What happens next isn't recorded in the Viking sagas. Those texts celebrate the gold taken, the slaves captured, the kingdoms humbled. They don't mention what happened in the hours between the screaming and the loading of the ships. Irish annals use one word: dishonored. That single word contains an ocean of suffering. This is not fiction. This happened. This is the story of how an entire class of women, educated, holy, protected by the most sacred laws of Christendom, were systematically destroyed, not just physically, but spiritually, culturally, and psychologically, in ways that made death seem like mercy. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated erasure. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. Here we unearth the chapters history tried to bury. The Vikings didn't just raid monasteries for gold. They understood something crucial about early medieval Ireland. The monasteries were the universities, the libraries, the hospitals, the diplomatic centers, and many were run by women or housed female communities alongside male ones. These weren't delicate ornaments of Christianity. They were power structures. The women inside held knowledge. They could read Latin and Old Irish. They copied medical texts, legal codes, astronomical tables. They owned property. They had political connections. Some were daughters of kings, placed in convents for education or protection. Others were widows who'd retained their dowries. A few were scholars in their own right. In Viking culture, these women represented something incomprehensible. They weren't married. They weren't concubines. They weren't slaves. They existed in a category that had no translation in Norse society. So the Vikings created a translation. With violence. The first documented raid on an Irish monastery housing women occurred in 795 at Patriarch. The attackers came in longships that could navigate both ocean and river. They struck at dawn. The nuns had no warning, no defense, no chance. What the Vikings did was efficient, methodical. They separated the women by age and appearance. The elderly were killed immediately. The very young were taken as thralls, future household slaves. But the women in between, the ones between 15 and 40, faced something worse. They were kept alive for the journey back to Scandinavia, weeks at sea, chained below deck or tied to the mast. No privacy, no dignity, no hope. The saga writers don't describe this part because it wasn't glorious. It wasn't worthy of poetry. It was just utility. But before you understand what happened on those ships and in those slave markets, you need to understand what these women lost. Not just their lives or their freedom. Something deeper. Something that made their survival more unbearable than death. In Irish law, a woman's honor was quantifiable. It had a legal price called log en enech. A nun's honor price was equal to that of a bishop. When that honor was violated, the law required payment. Massive payment. The violation of a consecrated woman was considered an offense against God, the church, and the entire social order. The Vikings didn't care about Irish law. They didn't recognize Christian sanctity. A nun to them was just a woman in strange clothes who couldn't fight back. Her vows meant nothing. Her education meant nothing. Her status meant nothing. They reduced her to her body. Then they sold that body in markets from Dublin to Kiev. The Irish chronicles record these events in formulaic language. The heathens came. Many were slain. The relics were taken. But sometimes a scribe breaks pattern. In the Annals of Ulster, year 836, one line stands out. After describing a raid on a monastery, the chronicler writes, "God's people were made into objects of mockery." Not killed, mocked. That word choice is deliberate. It tells you what mattered wasn't just the death toll. It was the humiliation, the inversion of sacred order. Think about that. These women had taken vows of chastity as a form of spiritual power. In a world where women's primary value was reproductive, they'd chosen a different path. They'd claimed their bodies for God, not for any man. That choice gave them autonomy, respect, legal standing. The Vikings stripped that away in the most literal, brutal way possible. They made their chastity a vulnerability. They turned their vows into a source of shame. Every violation was a theological destruction. It said, your God can't protect you. Your church can't save you. Your education can't help you. Your status doesn't matter. You are just meat, just cargo, just inventory. And if you survived, if you somehow endured the voyage and the sail and the years that followed, you could never go home. Irish law was clear. A woman who'd been violated, even by force, even as a victim, was no longer considered pure enough to return to a religious community. Her honor price was shattered. She was legally and spiritually contaminated. The Vikings didn't just take these women's freedom. They took their identity, their purpose, their place in the world, and any possibility of restoration. They engineered a fate where survival meant permanent exile from everything that had given life meaning. Death would have been cleaner, quicker, more merciful. But mercy wasn't the point, and what happened next would prove that even this calculated cruelty was just the beginning. The slave markets of Dublin operated in the open. No one tried to hide what was happening. By the mid-9th century, Dublin was the largest slave trading hub in Western Europe. Thousands of people passed through its pens every year. Irish, Scottish, English, men, women, children. But the nuns commanded special prices. Why? Because buyers knew these women could read and write. They could tend to medical needs. They could manage households. They understood diplomacy and negotiation. Their education made them valuable. Their trauma made them compliant. You need to understand the economics here. A typical Irish thrall might sell for 6 to 8 ounces of silver. A nun could fetch double that, sometimes triple. The Vikings had turned consecrated women into premium merchandise. Their vows, the very thing meant to set them apart for God, became a selling point for slavers. The buyers came from everywhere. Norse chieftains looking for concubines who could teach their children to read. Frankish merchants who needed translators. Arab traders from the Abbasid Caliphate who valued literate slaves for administrative work. The network stretched from Iceland to Baghdad. One chronicle mentions a nun from Kildare who ended up in the household of a Swedish jarl. She was forced to become his concubine. She bore him 3 children. When Christian missionaries arrived years later, she begged them to hear her confession. The missionaries refused. They said her situation was too complicated. She'd lived as a pagan's woman too long. Her soul was in question. She hanged herself the next day. Her name is lost. The chronicler doesn't record it. She's just a woman of God who fell into darkness. That erasure is its own violence. She survived the raid, the voyage, the sail, the years of captivity. But history didn't let her survive as a person, just as a category, just as a cautionary tale. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. The Vikings refined their techniques with each raid. They learned which monasteries housed women. They mapped the coastal routes. They timed their attacks for maximum surprise. By the 840s, they'd established permanent bases in Ireland, long forts, fortified harbors where they could overwinter and launch raids year-round. The Irish kingdoms tried to respond. Kings raised armies. Monks built round towers where communities could hide during attacks. The church excommunicated the raiders, though excommunication meant nothing to pagans. Nothing worked. The Vikings adapted faster than the Irish could defend, and the women kept disappearing, dozens at a time, then hundreds. In 845, the monastery at Clonmacnoise was attacked. 47 nuns were taken. The annals record their names: Maelmire, Gormley, Derbail, Liadane, Cacht. 47 names preserved in ink while the women themselves vanished into slavery. The act of recording their names was the only burial they'd receive. Some women tried to fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows defensive wounds on female skeletons found near monastery sites, broken forearms from trying to ward off blows, fractured skulls from standing their ground. These women weren't passive victims. They resisted. They just lost. Others tried to hide. The round towers could sometimes provide refuge if you reached them in time, but those towers had a flaw. Only one entrance, high off the ground. Once you pulled up the ladder, you were safe. Unless the raiders decided to wait. Unless they set fire to the base. Unless they were willing to starve you out. Then the tower became a tomb. In 850, Vikings besieged a round tower at Killedy for 3 days. 12 nuns were inside. The raiders couldn't reach them, so they filled the base with green wood and set it alight. The smoke rose thick and black. The women had a choice: suffocate or jump. The chronicles say they sang hymns until the smoke took them. No one was captured that day. The Vikings got no slaves, no ransom. Just 12 bodies in a tower full of smoke. You might think that's a victory. The women denied the raiders their prize. They maintained their vows even in death. But think about the precedent. Think about the message it sent to other communities. Your choices are captivity or suicide, violation or death. There is no third option. There is no rescue. There is no safety. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical violence. Monasteries that were raided once lived in constant fear of the next attack. Women slept in their habits, ready to run. They stopped copying manuscripts. Why invest months in a text that would just burn or get looted? They stopped cultivating gardens. Why plant what you won't harvest? They stopped planning futures. They lived in permanent present tense, survival measured in days. This wasn't brutality, it was protocol. The Vikings had turned terror into strategy. Every raid reinforced the message. Nothing is sacred. No one is safe. Resistance is futile. Eventually, some monasteries paid tribute just to be left alone. Silver for peace. Gold for mercy. But payment didn't guarantee protection. Sometimes the Vikings took the tribute and raided anyway. Sometimes they came back the next year demanding more. The extortion became another form of captivity. Communities bankrupted themselves trying to buy safety that never came. And still the women disappeared. The slave market swelled. The demographics of Ireland began to shift. Entire generations of educated women were ripped from the social fabric. The monasteries that survived stopped accepting female members. Too dangerous. Too much risk. By 870, most Irish monasteries had become exclusively male. The women's communities had been destroyed or disbanded. Hundreds of years of female scholarship, leadership, and spiritual authority ended in a single generation. The Vikings didn't just kill these women. They erased the entire institutional structure that had supported them. You can measure the loss in manuscripts. Before the Viking Age, Irish nuns produced some of the most sophisticated illuminated texts in Europe. Medical compendiums, botanical guides, astronomical charts, poetry. After the raids intensified, the output dropped to nearly nothing. We lost an entire literary tradition. Thousands of texts that were never copied, never preserved, never even imagined because the women who would have created them were gone. History calls this period the Viking Age, but for Irish women it was an apocalypse, a systematic destruction of everything they'd built, everything they'd become, everything they might have been. And the worst part? The part that made death seem merciful? The women who survived the raids and the markets and the years of slavery could never speak of what they'd endured. If they somehow made it back to Ireland, they couldn't return to religious life. They couldn't marry, not with their pasts. They couldn't integrate back into communities that saw them as contaminated. They became ghosts, living but not alive, present but erased. They'd survived the worst the Vikings could do, only to discover that survival itself was another form of death. The system was perfect in its cruelty, and it wouldn't stop until there was nothing left to take. In 914, a woman named Muireann returned to Ireland. She'd been gone 32 years. Taken in a raid on Clonmacnoise when she was 19, sold in Dublin, resold in York, eventually freed by a Christian merchant who'd grown too old to keep slaves. She had nowhere else to go, so she came home. The monastery at Clonmacnoise no longer housed women. The abbess told her there was no place for her there. Not anymore. Muireann asked if she could at least pray at the chapel where she'd taken her vows. The abbess refused. The space was consecrated. Muireann was not. She died that winter, alone. The local annals don't record where or how. Just that a woman once of God passed away. No name, no grave marker, no prayers. Her story isn't unique. It's the default. For every nun taken by Vikings, this was the outcome. Even if you survived, even if you returned, the world you'd known no longer existed. The community that had given your life meaning wouldn't take you back. The laws that had protected you now condemned you. You were living evidence of Christianity's failure to protect its own. Better to forget, better to erase, better to pretend you'd never existed at all. The Irish Church made a choice in the late 9th century. Instead of creating structures to reintegrate survivors, instead of offering sanctuary to women who'd endured captivity, they closed the door. They changed the rules. They made it so that any woman who'd been captured by Vikings was considered beyond redemption, not because of anything she'd done, but because of what had been done to her. Read that again. The Church punished victims for surviving. It added spiritual death to physical captivity. It ensured that there was no way out, no way forward, no path to restoration. This wasn't war, it was industry. And the Church became complicit in the destruction it claimed to oppose. The theological reasoning was clear. A consecrated woman's body belonged to God. If that body had been violated, it was no longer fit for holy service. It didn't matter that the violation was forced. It didn't matter that the woman had resisted. The pollution was considered objective, physical, permanent. This logic shows up in penitential texts from the period. Instructions for priests on how to handle returned captives. The language is clinical, detached. It treats these women like contaminated objects that need to be quarantined. Some texts recommend permanent penitence. Others suggest the women enter lay communities but never take vows again. A few, the harshest ones, say the women should be encouraged to join convents in distant lands where no one knows their history. Exile piled on exile, trauma doubled by abandonment. Meanwhile, the Vikings kept raiding, the women kept disappearing, and the Church kept looking away. You need to understand the scale. Between 795 and 950, historians estimate that at least 2,000 Irish nuns were captured by Viking raiders. That's a conservative number. Some scholars put it closer to 5,000. The actual figure is unknowable because most captures weren't recorded. Most women weren't important enough to name. They just vanished from the historical record like they'd never existed. 2,000 women. 2,000 lives destroyed. 2,000 stories erased. Each one was a person. Each one had a name, a history, hopes, talents, relationships. Each one mattered. But history treats them as statistics, as background noise to the larger saga of Viking expansion and Irish resistance. They deserve better than that. They deserve to be seen, to be remembered. Not as victims, not as cautionary tales, but as people who endured the unendurable and then were erased for surviving. The Vikings themselves left almost no record of what happened to these women. The sagas mention thralls in passing. The grave goods occasionally include female skeletons with Irish jewelry. But the details, the individual stories, the moments of suffering and resistance and despair, those are absent. The Norse literary tradition celebrated warriors, not slavers. Battles, not captivity. Honor, not commerce. So the story of what happened to Irish nuns exists in the gaps, in the silences, in the oblique references and the missing manuscripts and the monasteries that suddenly stopped housing women without explanation. You have to read between the lines. You have to notice what's not said. In 902, the Irish kings finally managed to expel the Vikings from Dublin. It was a short-lived victory. The Norse would return within 15 years. But for a brief moment, the slave markets closed. The longships departed. The raids paused. Some women came back during that window. Not many. A few dozen at most. They'd been freed or escaped or bought their own freedom with years of labor. They returned to an Ireland that didn't want them, that didn't know what to do with them, that wished they'd just stayed gone. One woman, a former nun named Babin, petitioned the High King for redress. She'd been taken from Kildare in 890, sold in Dublin, shipped to Iceland, spent 12 years in captivity. She'd survived. She'd returned. She wanted justice. She wanted compensation. She wanted acknowledgement. The High King refused to see her. His advisors sent a message. Her case was too complicated, too sensitive, too likely to set bad precedent. If they acknowledged her suffering, they'd have to acknowledge all the others. They'd have to confront the scope of the failure. They'd have to admit that the church and the crown had been powerless to protect the very women they claimed to cherish. Better to stay silent. Better to let Babin fade away. Better to pretend the problem didn't exist. She died in 905. No record of how or where. Just another ghost. Just another woman erased by the history she survived. This is the pattern. Victims return and are rejected. Survivors speak and are silenced. Evidence accumulates and is ignored. The system protects itself by sacrificing the people it was meant to save. It's not a failure of the system. It's how the system is designed to work. The Viking raids eventually slowed. By the mid-10th century, many Norse settlers had converted to Christianity. The slave trade continued, but became less indiscriminate. The monasteries adapted, building better defenses, diversifying their locations, reducing their visibility. Life went on. But the women didn't come back. The female monastic tradition in Ireland never fully recovered. The institutions were gone. The knowledge was lost. The continuity was broken. Irish women wouldn't regain anything close to the religious and intellectual authority they'd held in the 8th century until the modern era. That's more than 1,000 years of lost potential. A millennium of silence. You can see the impact in the manuscripts that survived. Before the Viking Age, Irish scriptoria produced works of stunning complexity. Intricate knotwork, elaborate marginalia, experimental theology. After, the work becomes more conservative, more derivative, more focused on preservation than innovation. The creative spark that had made Irish Christianity unique flickered and dimmed. Some of that was material. You can't illuminate manuscripts when raiders keep burning your workshop. But some was human. The women who'd pushed boundaries, who'd argued theology, who'd trained the next generation. They were gone. And with them went an entire way of thinking about faith, learning, and women's place in both. The Vikings didn't just destroy bodies and buildings. They destroyed possibilities. They collapsed futures. They made it so that things which had been possible became unimaginable. And then history, written mostly by men, forgot that women had ever been central to Irish religious life at all. That forgetting is its own atrocity. It completes the work the Vikings started. It finishes the erasure. It ensures that the suffering, the resistance, the survival, all of it disappears into footnotes and academic debates and YouTube videos like this one that most people will never watch. But you're watching. You're listening. You're bearing witness to what happened. And that matters more than you know. The archaeological evidence tells a story the texts won't. In the 1970s, excavations at a former monastery site in County Meath uncovered a mass grave. 12 female skeletons, all between the ages of 15 and 30, all showing signs of healed fractures from earlier in life, all buried in unconsecrated ground, outside the monastery walls. No grave goods, no Christian burial. No markers, just bodies in the dirt. The fracture patterns were consistent with manual labor, heavy, repetitive work, the kind you'd do as a slave. The archaeologists concluded these were likely former nuns who'd been captured, enslaved, and somehow returned. They'd lived near the monastery but weren't allowed inside. They'd remained Christian but weren't considered worthy of Christian burial. The monastery buried them like animals, like contaminants, like mistakes that needed to be hidden. That grave represents a choice. Someone decided these women didn't deserve proper burial. Someone made the call that their suffering disqualified them from basic dignity. Someone looked at these returned survivors and saw only pollution. Who was that person? An abbot? A bishop? A local lord? We don't know. The records don't say. But the grave remains. The evidence persists. The cruelty is undeniable. Other sites tell similar stories. At Clonmacnoise, archaeologists found post holes suggesting a separate enclosure built in the late 9th century. Small, isolated, far from the main monastic buildings. The construction is consistent with a containment structure. A place to house people you don't want mixing with the community. Some scholars think this was where returned captives lived. A kind of quarantine. Close enough that the monastery could claim to be charitable. Far enough that the contamination couldn't spread. The women would have been fed, given shelter, even allowed to attend services from a distance. But they'd never be full members again. Never be recognized, never be restored. They'd exist in permanent limbo, between worlds, belonging nowhere. Think about what that does to a person. You survive years of captivity. You endure horrors you can't speak of. You finally escape or are freed. You make the dangerous journey home. And when you arrive, your own community builds a fence around you. They feed you through a gap in the wall. They pray for your soul while treating you like a disease. How do you survive that? How do you keep faith? How do you not go mad? Some didn't survive it. The skeletal remains from these isolated enclosures show signs of malnutrition and disease. The women were dying slowly, even in safety, even home. The trauma had entered their bones. The captivity had become cellular. They carried it in their bodies long after the chains were gone. The Viking Age officially ended around 1100. The Norse integrated, the raids stopped. Ireland entered a new phase of its history. But for the women who'd survived the raids, the age never ended. It just transformed. Captivity became exile. Violence became neglect. The Vikings' cruelty became the church's abandonment. Same destruction, different method. In 1132, a reforming movement swept through Irish Christianity. New monastic orders from the continent brought new rules. The Cistercians, the Augustinians, the Benedictines. They rebuilt institutions. They reinvigorated religious life. They created new opportunities for men to serve God in structured, supported communities. They created almost nothing for women. The suspicion lingered. The fear of contamination persisted. Any woman of a certain age was potentially a returned captive, potentially polluted, potentially dangerous to the community's purity. Better to exclude them all than risk admitting one who might carry the stain of the Viking Age. This is how trauma becomes structural, how violence becomes policy, how cruelty becomes tradition. The Vikings were gone, but their impact remained, encoded in rules and customs and unspoken assumptions that would last for centuries. The Irish legal texts from the 12th century show the evolution clearly. Older law codes from before the Viking Age treat nuns as high-status legal actors. They can own property, bring suits, serve as witnesses. Later codes are silent on these points, not because they explicitly revoke these rights, but because the category has ceased to exist. There are no nuns to have rights. The possibility has been erased. You can watch an entire class of people disappear from law simply by not mentioning them. Absence becomes its own violence. Silence becomes its own destruction. The few women's monastic communities that did form in later medieval Ireland were tiny, peripheral, underfunded. They survived on the margins, always one crisis away from dissolution. They never regained the intellectual vitality or institutional power of their pre-Viking predecessors. The continuity was broken too thoroughly. The knowledge was lost too completely. We don't even know what we're missing. The manuscripts that were never copied. The medical knowledge that died with the women who held it. The theological arguments that were silenced mid-sentence when the longships arrived. The poems, the prayers, the botanical studies, the astronomical observations, all of it gone. Burned or looted or just abandoned when the women who created them vanished. Historians call this a dark age for Irish women's religious history. But that phrase obscures the reality. It wasn't dark because of lack of sources. It was dark because of deliberate destruction. The Vikings created the darkness. The church maintained it. And history, by focusing on kings and battles and political shifts, has kept it dark ever since. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of a turbulent period. This was targeted, systematic, effective. It destroyed an entire tradition and then erased the evidence of its own destruction. But the evidence persists if you know where to look. In mass graves and isolated enclosures, in missing manuscripts and abandoned monasteries, in legal silences and changed traditions, in the gap between what Irish Christianity was in the 8th century and what it became by the 12th. That gap is where thousands of women existed, where they suffered, where they survived, where they were forgotten. You're filling that gap now, by listening, by remembering, by refusing to let the silence be the final word. That matters. That's not just history. That's justice. Delayed, incomplete, but real. And the story isn't quite finished yet. There's one more chapter, one more turn of the screw, one more way the cruelty became permanent. You need to hear it. You need to understand how thorough the destruction was, because only then can you grasp what was truly lost. In 1169, the Normans invaded Ireland. They brought new structures, new laws, new forms of Christianity. They also brought new assumptions about women's religious life, shaped by their own history. History that didn't include the Irish tradition of powerful female monastics. History that saw nuns as enclosed, silent, subordinate. The Norman reforms completed what the Vikings started. They formalized the exclusion of women from religious authority. They made enclosure mandatory for all female religious. They cut off the last threads connecting Irish nuns to their pre-Viking heritage. By 1200, it was illegal for an Irish convent to teach Latin to its members. Literacy, the thing that had made nuns valuable as slaves, was now forbidden as too dangerous for women to possess. The knowledge that had survived the raids couldn't survive the reforms. The church finished the Vikings' work. This is how conquest layers on conquest, how violence becomes precedent, how destruction becomes tradition. The Vikings made it possible to see Irish religious women as vulnerable, as capturable, as less than fully protected by divine or human authority. The church's abandonment of survivors reinforced that view. And the Normans, arriving centuries later, inherited a world where powerful, educated, autonomous religious women were already unimaginable. The system was self-perpetuating. Each generation forgot a little more. Each reform removed another possibility. Each text that prioritized male monastics over female ones made women's religious history harder to recover. By the time modern historians started investigating the Viking Age's impact on Ireland, the women were already footnotes, already marginal, already ghosts. The work of excavating their stories, of recovering their names, of honoring their resistance and mourning their losses, that work is still barely begun. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. This wasn't brutality. It was protocol. This wasn't war. It was industry. And the product was erasure. Thorough, multi-generational, nearly complete erasure of women who'd been powerful, educated, and autonomous. Women who dared to claim authority in a world that punished such claims with slavery, abandonment, and historical oblivion. You need to understand what that means for how we read history. Every time a text says, the monastery was raided, you need to ask, what happened to the women? Every time a chronicle says, many were taken captive, you need to wonder, where did they go? What did they endure? Did they survive? If so, how? And were they ever allowed to tell their stories? Usually the answer is no. Usually the silence is absolute. But that silence isn't neutral. It's not an absence of information. It's an active suppression. It's the continuation of the violence by other means. The Vikings wielded axes and chains. The church wielded canon law and excommunication. Historians wielded selectivity and omission. Different tools, same result. Women removed from the record. Women denied their own narratives. Women reduced to categories and cautionary tales and uncomfortable questions that get shelved for later. Later never comes. Until now. Until this moment. Until you decide that these women, these specific women with their specific suffering and resistance and survival, matter enough to remember, to speak of, to honor. Not as victims, though they were victimized. Not as saints, though some were holy. But as people. As full, complex human beings who lived through hell and deserved to be seen. That's the work. That's the only antidote to erasure. Remembering. Speaking. Refusing to let silence stand as the final answer. It won't undo the suffering. It won't resurrect the dead or heal the survivors. But it will restore something essential. It will acknowledge that the suffering happened, that it mattered, that the people who endured it mattered. Silence isn't erasure. You're proof of that. By watching this, by engaging with this story, by carrying it forward, you're breaking the silence. You're making it impossible for these women to be fully forgotten. That's not nothing. That's everything. This story started with a monastery on a cliff, with fog and gulls and bells, with a woman named Deirdre transcribing scripture by candlelight. She didn't survive. Her manuscript was destroyed. Her community was scattered. Her name was preserved in one annal and nowhere else. But she was here. She was real. She mattered. They all mattered. Every woman whose name we've lost. Every survivor who was turned away. Every skeleton in unconsecrated ground. Every slave in a Dublin pen. Every captive on a longship. Every ghost in an isolated enclosure. Every absence in the historical record. They were all people. They all deserved better. They all still do. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or sad or determined to learn more, hit the like button. Subscribe to this channel. We dig into the histories that textbooks skip. We honor the people who get reduced to footnotes. We refuse to let the victors be the only ones who tell the story. Drop a comment telling me what historical event or group you think deserves this treatment. What story needs to be told? What silence needs to be broken? Your suggestions shape what we cover next. And remember this. The violence we've discussed here, the systematic destruction and erasure, it didn't only happen in 9th century Ireland. It's a pattern. It repeats across cultures, across centuries, across contexts. Different victims, different perpetrators, different justifications, but the same essential cruelty, the same willingness to destroy those who can't fight back, the same impulse to forget rather than confront. Your job, if you choose to accept it, is to notice, to remember, to refuse the easy comfort of ignorance. These women were denied their voices in life and in death. But you have a voice. Use it. Tell their story. Make sure their suffering wasn't meaningless. Make sure history, at least in this small way, is finally just. That's all history ever is, a conversation between the dead and the living. The dead can't speak anymore. But we can. And what we choose to say, what we choose to remember, that determines who they get to be. Not victims, not footnotes, not ghosts, but people. Complicated, resilient, worthy of memory. The Vikings did something worse than death to Irish monastery women. They made survival unbearable. They turned rescue into rejection. They ensured that the trauma would outlast the captivity. And then history, our history, the history we tell and retell, made it worse still by forgetting them entirely. We can't undo that, but we can refuse to continue it. We can choose to remember. We can choose to speak. We can choose to honor the dead by telling the truth. That's the only power we have. But it's enough. It has to be. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for refusing to let their silence be the end of their story.